The message came 3 days late. A simple line from my son, Mark, that said, "Happy birthday," followed by a casual jab asking why I hadn't reminded him. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking into a familiar hollow place. At 68, living alone in my New York apartment, I should have known better than to expect more. But in that moment, it wasn't just a forgotten birthday. It felt like I had been erased, like the years of love, sacrifice, and presence meant nothing at all. I read his words over and over, hoping I had misunderstood. A birthday is not something a mother should have to remind her child about. The day I brought him into the world, the day my life changed forever, how could that be treated like an afterthought? At first, there was confusion, a weak voice inside me trying to excuse him. Maybe he was busy, maybe it slipped his mind. But then another voice rose stronger, one that had been buried for years. Why should a mother have to beg her son to remember she exists? The sting turned quickly into a deep ache. I thought of the cake I had baked with aching hands, waiting by the window like a fool. I thought of the phone that never rang, the silence that filled the hours. By the time his message finally arrived, the hurt hardened into something sharper. I felt invisible, reduced to someone responsible for her own neglect, blamed for not demanding his attention. That was the moment something inside me shifted. For decades, I had opened my wallet whenever Mark or Nina asked. House payments, school tuition, endless bills. They leaned on me, and I allowed it. I told myself it was love. But what kind of love forgets the one day meant to honor me? Standing there with my phone in hand? I realized I had been holding up a family that barely remembered I was part of it. So I did something I never thought I would. I picked up the phone, but not to call Mark. I called my lawyer. I asked him to freeze the trust fund that very afternoon. No more automatic payments, no more quiet enabling. Within hours, the financial lifeline they took for granted was gone. And for the first time in years, I felt strangely powerful. That single choice would set off a chain of events I couldn't have imagined. But before I explain how my son reacted, I need to take you back through the years that led to this moment, the long road of sacrifice that made me blind to the warning signs. After Robert passed away, life shifted in a way I never fully prepared for. I was still grieving, still learning how to breathe in a home that felt too quiet, when I found myself stepping into a role I hadn't anticipated. My husband had left me comfortable, but instead of using that security for my own peace, I poured it into my son Mark and his new wife, Nina. At first, it felt like the natural thing to do, help them build their life, carry them through the rough spots. I told myself it was what family does. I paid for Mark's legal fees when his first marriage crumbled, thinking it would give him a chance to start fresh without financial ruin. I covered the honeymoon to Italy when he remarried Nina, convincing myself it was a gift of love, a way to bless their beginning, when they fell in love with a house far beyond their means. I wrote a check for the down payment without hesitation. Tuition for the kids, endless bills, shopping sprees that Nina insisted were necessities. It all came from me. Month after month, year after year, I kept saying yes. For a long time, I convinced myself I was doing something noble. I imagined that one day they would look back and see me as the steady hand that guided them, the anchor that kept them secure. But slowly, I began to notice how one-sided it all felt. Their gratitude grew quieter. Their visits became shorter. Even the way they spoke to me shifted, less warmth, more expectation. It was as if my value was measured in dollar signs. And then came the birthday. I had spent hours in my kitchen, my arthritic hands struggling with the mixing bowl, determined to make Mark's favorite chocolate cake just like I had every year since he was 5. I even texted him that morning, letting him know it was ready whenever he wanted to stop by. All day I waited. Every time a car drove past, I peeked through the curtains, hoping it was his. Every time the phone buzzed, my heart leapt, only to sink again when it wasn't him. By nightfall, the cake sat untouched, the silence deafening. For 3 days, that cake sat there, growing stale, until I finally scraped it into the trash. That sound, the metal spoon against the sink, the recipe sliding into the disposal, felt like the sound of my hope breaking. After all those years of giving, the one thing I wanted in return was to feel remembered. And even that was too much to ask. It was in that moment, standing in my kitchen with empty hands and an empty heart, that I began to see things clearly. What I thought was sacrifice was really surrender. What I thought was love had become dependency, and the anger that started to rise inside me was different this time. It wasn't the quiet hurt I used to swallow. It was sharper, stronger, and ready to do something about it. That anger would soon carry me to the next step, one that would change everything the moment I decided to finally cut them off. The morning after I threw away that untouched cake, I picked up the phone with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I called my lawyer and told him to shut down the trust fund. No warning, no explanations, just silence where money used to flow. By that afternoon, the payments Mark and Nina counted on to cover their mortgage, their cars, and all the extras simply stopped. For the first time since Robert passed, I made a choice entirely for myself. At first, there was quiet, a deceptive, almost soothing quiet. I sat in my armchair with a cup of tea, the city humming faintly outside my window, and I let the stillness wrap around me. But by evening, the storm broke. My phone lit up once, then twice, then over and over. Mark's name filled the screen again and again, his desperation ringing through the silence I refused to break. By midnight, the missed calls climbed into the dozens. His panic came in waves, and each one crashed against the wall I had finally built. I could almost picture him pacing, confused, maybe even angry, as if life had suddenly played a cruel trick. For years, I had been the one on edge, waiting for scraps of affection. Now he was the one begging, and I sat still, letting the phone buzz unanswered on the table beside me. It was almost funny in its symmetry. There were texts, too short, frantic bursts about banking errors and bounced payments. Each one revealed more of his unraveling, but instead of breaking me down, they only confirmed what I had long suspected my worth to him was measured in deposits, not in love. And strangely, instead of pain, I felt a calm, almost sweet satisfaction. That night, as I turned off the lamp and slipped into bed, I realized something profound. The silence wasn't empty, it was powerful. For years, I had been the one holding my breath, waiting to be noticed. Now, it was Mark who couldn't rest, who couldn't breathe without my answer. I fell asleep easier than I had in months, knowing that at last, the balance had shifted. But I also knew the silence wouldn't last forever. Desperation has a way of reinventing itself, and soon, I would see just how far Mark and Nina were willing to go to claw their way back into my good graces. It was almost amusing how quickly the tone shifted. Just days after the trust fund dried up, the same son who had ignored my birthday suddenly remembered I existed. The silence that once stretched for weeks was replaced with a flood of calls, cheerful voicemails, and texts that sounded rehearsed. A bouquet of roses appeared on my doorstep, with a card signed by Nina, written in the kind of flowery language I had never once heard from her mouth. There were even handwritten notes from the children, each one suspiciously neat, as if guided by an adult hand. At first, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to imagine that the money had nothing to do with it, that maybe the distance of the past few years had cracked and they were finally reaching back toward me. For a moment, I let myself savor the sound of Mark's voice pretending to care, the brief warmth of his questions about my health, the sudden urgency with which he asked about visiting. But it didn't take long for the sweetness to sour. The timing was too neat, the affection too forced. It wasn't love, it was theater. The hardest moment came with Ella, my granddaughter. She called one evening, her little voice bright and rehearsed. She told me she missed me, that I should come over soon, that her daddy said we were all a family and families shouldn't fight. I could almost hear Mark coaching her from across the room. My heart twisted in two directions at once, one part aching with love for her innocence, the other burning with anger at how easily a child's love could be manipulated. I whispered back the only thing I could, that I loved her more than she could ever know, and that my love for her had nothing to do with money. Nothing to do with what the adults said or did. After the call, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the roses wilting in their vase. I realized then that the flowers, the letters, the phone calls, all of it was just another transaction, another way to keep the money flowing. I wasn't being remembered. I was being managed. The ache of that discovery was sharper than Mark's forgotten birthday, sharper than the years of being taken for granted, because this time, they were using affection itself as currency, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But I did notice. And as the bitterness settled in, I understood that this sudden wave of attention was only a mask. Behind it, something darker was waiting. I could feel it pressing at the edges of their performance, and soon enough, the truth would reveal itself in a way I wasn't prepared for. It started with small things, the kind of details most people would brush aside. A folder left half open on the counter when I visited Mark's house, pages with my name printed in bold letters, words like guardianship and medical evaluation scattered across the page. When I asked about it, Nina quickly slid the papers out of sight. Her smile stretched too wide, her voice too sweet. Something inside me tightened, a whisper of unease I couldn't shake. Then came the phone calls I wasn't meant to overhear. Mark didn't realize I was standing just outside his office door one afternoon. His voice was hushed, urgent, asking someone about timelines and signatures, about how soon things could be finalized. The word incompetent slipped through the crack in the door like a blade, cutting straight to the bone. For a moment, I froze. My own son was speaking about me as if I were a burden to be managed, a problem to be signed away. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I had misunderstood, but the signs piled up too neatly to ignore. A friend from church pulled me aside after Sunday service, her face pale with concern. She said she had overheard Nina at the pharmacy, asking questions about doctors who specialized in mental evaluations for seniors. I felt the blood drain from my face. Suddenly, every awkward pause, every exaggerated gesture of kindness from them, snapped into focus. They weren't trying to win me back. They were building a case. The realization settled over me like a storm cloud. Mark and Nina weren't just ungrateful, they were dangerous. They wanted more than my money. They wanted my independence, my voice, my freedom. If they succeeded, every decision about my life, from what I ate to where I lived, would no longer be mine. I would become a shadow in my own home, trapped by the people I had sacrificed everything for. Fear came first. My heart raced each time the phone rang, wondering if it was another step in their plan. I found myself double-checking the locks, rereading my own notes to prove to myself I was still sharp. But fear quickly gave way to something else: anger. A deep, burning anger that shook me to my core. After decades of giving, of bending, of carrying them on my back, this was how they repaid me, by trying to erase me while I was still alive. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the evidence spread before me. My suspicions no longer whispers, but a clear, chilling truth. I wasn't dealing with simple neglect or selfishness anymore. This was betrayal at its cruelest. And as heavy as the weight of it felt, I also knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let them succeed. The stakes had never been higher. They wanted to take my life away from me piece by piece, but I still had fight left in me. And if they were preparing for war, then so was I. When I first uncovered what Mark and Nina were plotting, the fear hit me like a tidal wave. For a moment, I felt small, like an old woman cornered in her own home, stripped of dignity by the very people I had loved the most. But once the initial sting settled, something else rose up inside me. A quiet, steady fire. I knew then I wasn't going to be their victim. Not now. Not ever. If they wanted a fight for my independence, they were going to learn just how sharp I still was. The first step was simple protection. I picked up the phone and contacted the one man who had stood by me through every financial change after Robert passed my lawyer. Richard. I didn't come to him in tears, begging for help. No. I walked into his office the next morning with my back straight, my pearls on, and a list of questions in my hand. I needed to know exactly what it would take to shield myself legally, what loopholes Mark and Nina might exploit, and how to cut them off at every angle. Richard looked at me with a mix of concern and respect, but I made it clear I wasn't asking for pity. I was planning my defense. Then came the second step, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mind was intact. If they wanted to whisper lies about me being unstable, I would crush that lie with hard evidence. I scheduled a full psychological and neurological evaluation with one of the top specialists in Manhattan. I spent hours answering their questions, completing tests, recalling details from decades ago with clarity I had almost forgotten I still possessed. When the doctor handed me the report, clean bill of health, excellent cognitive function, I felt a thrill run through me. Let them try to say otherwise. I had it in writing now. But I knew paperwork wasn't enough. Betrayal runs deep, and I needed to know just how far they had gone behind my back. That's when I turned to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a private investigator named Claire Benson. She was discreet, sharp, and relentless. I gave her one instruction: find everything: their bank accounts, their debts, their dealings with lawyers, anything that could expose the truth. Handing the task over to her felt like slipping a final piece into place. While Mark and Nina were busy staging their little performances, they had no idea I was already building the case that could dismantle them completely. Day by day, I moved with calm precision. I made my tea, read my books, smiled politely when neighbors asked about the family. On the surface, I was the same old Dorothy, but underneath, I was sharpening my tools, brick by brick, constructing the wall that would protect me. It almost amused me to think how blind they were to the storm gathering right over their heads. By the time the week ended, my fear had evaporated. In its place was something far stronger, a fierce, deliberate resolve. They thought they could erase me, control me, steal from me. But what they didn't realize was that I was already 2 steps ahead. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was preparing for battle. And soon enough, that battle would come. The stage was being set, and I would be ready when the curtain rose. I remember the day I decided it was time for the confrontation. There had been weeks of quiet preparation, lawyers, evaluations, investigators, and all of it led to this moment. I walked up the steps to Mark and Nina's house with a calmness I hadn't felt in years. My heart was steady, not racing. I wasn't the mother desperate for scraps of affection anymore. I was a woman who finally understood her worth. Inside, they tried to play the same roles they had rehearsed for years, concerned voices, false smiles, those masks of love stretched too thin. But I saw through every crack. I had seen enough. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I began to lay the pieces of evidence down like cards on a table. First, the reports from the private investigator, copies of emails, documents they thought I'd never see, proving they were moving behind my back. I could feel the air shift when I placed them on the coffee table. Then came the evaluation. I told them how I had gone on my own, willingly, to a professional who confirmed what I already knew. My mind was sharp, clear, capable. The paper in my hand wasn't just a medical statement, it was my shield. Their story about me being incompetent collapsed before my eyes. I could see Nina's face tighten, her lips pressing into a thin line, and Mark's hands fidgeting as though he wished he could snatch the evidence away. Finally, I told them about the lawyer, how my estate was now fully protected, with layers they couldn't touch. Their grand plan to strip me of control and claim what wasn't theirs had been dismantled, piece by piece, before they even realized what was happening. They scrambled. Excuses poured out like water from a broken faucet, claims of misunderstanding, of only wanting to help, of me being paranoid. But I had lived too many years in that fog of guilt and manipulation to believe it anymore. Their words didn't reach me. I was watching them unravel, and instead of feeling fear, I felt something close to freedom. The climax wasn't a scream. It wasn't a slammed door. It was me telling them, in the calmest voice I could muster, that I no longer owed them anything, that I was done being used, done being treated like an endless resource, that I was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my peace. And then, just like that, I stood up. I didn't linger to comfort them. I didn't try to soften the blow. I walked out of that house with my head high, leaving their silence behind me like ashes after a fire. For the first time in decades, I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking away with power, and with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the chains they tried to wrap around me had finally been broken. But as the door closed behind me, I also knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something else. A life I would have to rebuild, piece by piece. But this time, on my own terms. And that thought carried me forward, straight into the peace I had been craving for so long. When the storm finally passed, I was surprised by the quiet that followed. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the kind of quiet that feels like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. For the first time in decades, I didn't wake up bracing myself for disappointment. I woke up simply asking, what do I want today? My mornings are mine again. Sometimes I bake, not the grand chocolate cakes I used to make for others, but small treats just for me. I take my time, letting the smell of butter and sugar fill my kitchen, knowing I don't have to wait for anyone else's approval to enjoy it. Other days, I walk through the park near my apartment, watching the seasons shift, listening to the laughter of strangers' children without the sting of longing. It's strange how peace can feel so new. Even at 68, I've learned something I wish I had understood sooner. Family doesn't always equal love. Blood ties can sometimes become chains, and protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was the most loving choice I could make. For years, I thought sacrifice was the same as devotion, but real love doesn't drain you dry. Real love gives back, even in small ways. I also learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors I choose when to open and when to close. Saying no to Mark and Nina didn't mean I stopped loving them as my son and daughter-in-law. It meant I finally started loving myself enough to stop being used. That realization has given me a kind of strength I never thought I'd feel again. Some evenings, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and let myself reflect on everything that happened. Yes, it hurts to accept that the people I gave so much to could betray me so deeply, but it would hurt more to keep living blind to it. The truth, as painful as it was, gave me back my freedom. And if you're listening to my story, maybe you've been in a place like this too, torn between love and self-respect, between wanting to be needed and needing to protect your heart. I want you to know you're not alone. You can choose yourself and still be whole. As I close this chapter, I carry no regret, only wisdom and a hope that others will find the courage to step into their own strength sooner than I did. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment if you've ever had to choose boundaries over blind loyalty. And don't forget to like this video if you believe, as I do, that dignity and self-love are worth protecting at any age. Because sometimes, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is simply the chance to live in peace.